You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Things change, but Deer Park Natural Spring Water is a constant you can count on, bringing you the essence of home for 150 years and counting. Sourced from carefully selected springs, Deer Park Natural Spring Water has naturally occurring electrolytes for a crisp, refreshing taste. Find Deer Park Natural Spring Water at your favorite local retailer today. After 150 years, there's only one thing left to say. Deer Park, that's still good water.
Hello, this is Matt from the Explorers Podcast. I want to invite you to join me on the voyages and journeys of the most famous explorers in the history of the world. These are the thrilling and captivating stories of Magellan, Shackleton, Lewis and Clark, and so many other famous and not so famous adventurers from throughout history. Go to explorerspodcast.com or just look us up on your podcast app. That's the Explorers Podcast.
Hello everyone, and welcome to History of the Great War Revisited, Episode 5, The Anglo-German Naval Arms Race, Dreadnought. Last episode, we discussed some of the reforms put in place by Admiral Fisher after he became the First Lord of the Admiralty. These included wide-ranging personnel reforms, a reorganization of the Royal Navy's strength around the world, and the retirement of over 100 ships that Fisher considered to be obsolete. In Fisher's mind, all of these reforms were essential to ensure that the Royal Navy was ready to fight a major war, both from a fleet capabilities and a budgetary perspective. These reforms would take place at the same time that the British and German navies were beginning to view each other as major sea power rivals, with both nations beginning to more openly discuss the fact that their building programs were being driven by the actions of the other. This viewpoint, especially on the German side, would be increased by the introduction of Fisher's most lasting legacy, the Dreadnought. The Dreadnought, interestingly enough, was not a huge technological leap from the previous generation of British battleships. There would be a few new technologies used, but it was not the technical changes that sets Dreadnought apart so decisively from other naval warships. Instead, it was the conceptual and theoretical changes that would cause some of its design changes that would prove to be the most important. It is usually stated that the introduction of the Dreadnought made all existing battleships obsolete. And it did, but mostly because it was a ship that was optimized specifically to destroy other large ships. Every other concern was secondary. This would alter how battleships were designed and constructed. The entire design ethos would change, and the Dreadnought's primary design philosophy of big guns and speed would be the standard until battleships fell out of favor during the Second World War. British concerns about German naval expansion would begin after the German Naval Law of 1898. This was the first naval law introduced by Tirpitz, and it called for the creation of a German fleet which would be led by 19 battleships, and then the appropriate number of smaller vessels. The Naval Law of 1900 then expanded upon this number slightly, providing for 26 battleships to be constructed by 1920. Over the next 5 years, the German Navy would begin to build at a rate to fulfill these naval laws. The British Admiralty would begin to be concerned in 1901, when multiple ships had been laid down and the first German capital ships were approaching operational status. A key reason for this concern was that it was becoming clear that the German government was very serious about carrying out its plans. Lord Selborne would write to others in the British cabinet in late 1901 that, quote, "The Emperor seems determined that the power of Germany shall be used all the world over to push German commerce, possessions, and interests. Of necessity, it follows that the German naval strength must be raised so as to compare more advantageously than at present with ours." End quote. These concerns would simmer for several years before erupting in 1905 due to concerns in Germany that the British were about to attack. These concerns were prompted by the fact that the British and French had in April 1904 signed the Entente Cordiale, which seemed to kind of remove the possibility of an Anglo-French conflict. Then, in March 1905, the Moroccan crisis occurred, which was caused by disagreements about Germany's future in Morocco. This crisis would coincide with some of Fisher's reforms, specifically the repositioning of some of the capital ships of the fleet. This resulted in a greater portion of the Royal Navy's strength being in position to attack Germany in the North Sea. Germany's entire naval strategy, based on Tirpitz's risk theory, was built around the idea that they had to build up strengths quickly so that the British could not risk an attack. The addition of so many ships into British home waters caused some German leaders to believe that there was a possibility of a naval war happening quite soon, to the point that all German military vessels were recalled to home waters. At the same time, there was a huge swing in British public opinion aimed specifically at the German Navy. The British press, in what would become a constant refrain, criticized Germany for building a navy that was, according to the press, clearly an offensive weapon that was aimed at other European powers. It was clear, again according to the press, that Germany had no defensive need for a fleet. It was a land power. On the other hand, of course, the British had to have a fleet, and it was clearly a completely defensive fleet. This should be obvious to everybody because it did not have a large army with which to invade other countries, so obviously the fleet was defensive. German leaders would claim that these accusations were completely incorrect, and that the fleet was required to defend Germany's colonies and its overseas trade, which was growing by the year. They would continue to use these talking points pretty much on both sides for years. But of course, the British press did not believe the Germans, and the Germans couldn't do anything about the British press. During these years, there was a general fear among German leaders, Tirpitz and the Emperor included, that the British were going to launch a preemptive strike against them to halt their naval construction before it really even got started. These feelings of danger and vulnerability were then heightened when they started to hear rumors about what would become the Dreadnought. While the HMS Dreadnought would be the most famous evolution of the battleship idea, there were other changes that would become famous with the Dreadnought that were already being investigated by other armies around the world. The most direct example of some of this would be the changes happening in the Italian naval designs, or at least among some Italian naval designers, as far back as 1901. These changes were driven by the Italian engineer Vittorio Cuniberti. Cuniberti would be an important contributor to Italian and international naval literature during this period, including multiple contributions to Jane's fighting ships, which was a critical way in which new naval designs were spread around the world. Cuniberti's primary points of evolution were around speed and mounting only one large caliber of guns. Around the importance of speed in the designs, he would say, quote, that fast ships are an absolute necessity of the day, and slow ships, however powerful they might be, have everything to lose in the future development of strategic warfare due to the employment of scouts and wireless telegraphy, end quote. Cuniberti's emphasis on speed was not exactly new. There were advocates for speed in many navies, and so the more important evolution that Cuniberti was pushing for was the use of only one type of guns, although he did not necessarily think that they had to be the largest guns available. His focus was more on how much easier it made the design and provisioning of a ship if it only had to worry about one caliber of guns, saying that future battleships, quote, will consist of from 12 to 16 guns of the same size, bringing with it the well-understood advantages of one size of ammunition, which is absolutely necessary, end quote. Now, even though Cuniberti was moving his thoughts towards where the Dreadnought would later go, it is worth saying that the Italians were not sort of ready or willing to take his designs and his ideas and kind of turn them into naval reality. From a funding and technology perspective, the Italian Navy would also be unable to turn Cuniberti's ideas into ships, soon at all. But they would be his works would be important thought pieces that would begin moving other naval minds in a similar direction. Official development of the Dreadnought would begin on December 11th, 1904, when Fisher created a committee on designs. This committee would contain both civilian and military experts around naval design and technology. Their instructions were to investigate the designs of 3 different types of ships. The first was a small, fast torpedo craft, which was really structured around Fisher's ideas on flotilla defense. The second design would be a 21-knot fast battleship that would eventually morph into the Dreadnought design. And the third design was a 25-knot armored cruiser, which would eventually, although not directly, become the battlecruiser concept. For both the battleship and armored cruiser, the instructions required that they be built around a uniform armament of 12-inch guns. While these top-level attributes were already decided, like the size of the guns, beyond them, the committee was kind of given sort of free range to work out the details. It would meet for almost 2 months in early 1905, and during that time it would work on the details of the new ship. The committee would release its first progress report in February 1905, which contained outlines of the designs of the larger ships. It would be several more months before the designs were approved by the Admiralty. The most notable outcome of these plans was the main armament. Up until this point, no battleship had been equipped with more than 4 12-inch guns. Instead, there had been an emphasis on devoting both weight and space to secondary armament, and even tertiary armament. The Dreadnought did away with this secondary armament completely, which was generally made up of 4 and 6-inch guns, and instead it would just focus on everything being the 12-inch guns. With so much focus on these guns and so much weight and so much space put into them, 10 of them could be mounted on the ship. This would allow the Dreadnought to have an 8-gun broadside, which was just straight up double what any other ship in the world was capable of. The arrangement of the Dreadnought's turrets, with 3 double centerline turrets and then a double turret on each side of the ship, also gave it the ability to bring at least 6 guns to bear in almost any direction. Again, a really powerful ability. This made it up to 3 times stronger in terms of firepower than any other ship in sort of non-optimal or non-broadside engagements, which were always going to happen. The general talking points for the ship was that 10 dreadnoughts would be equal to 20 pre-dreadnoughts broadside and 30 pre-dreadnoughts in every other situation. While the large guns, and the number of them, would be the most notable and kind of flashy change for the Dreadnought, Fisher was almost more concerned with its speed. Here's Fisher talking about the importance he placed on speed. Quote, "The sole reason for the existence of the old line of battleship was that ship was the only vessel that could not be destroyed except by a vessel of equal class. Fundamentally, the battleship sacrifices speed for a superior armament and protective armor. But it is the superiority of speed that enables an enemy ships to be overhauled or evaded, and that constitutes the real difference between the 2 types of ship, the battleship and the armored cruiser. It is evidently absolutely a necessity in future construction to make the speed of the battleship approach as nearly as possible that of the armored cruiser." End quote. The speed chosen for the Dreadnought was 21 knots, which would make it 2 knots faster than any other battleship in the world. This would give the Dreadnought the ability to cruise if and when it would engage an enemy ship. The key to achieving that speed were steam turbine engines. Turbines had been equipped in smaller ships before they were incorporated into the Dreadnought, but they were still seen as a very new and untried technology, and this would be the first time that they would be placed on a capital ship the size of the Dreadnought. A turbine was much better than the previous triple expansion reciprocating engine, while also being smaller and lighter than the previous engines as well. The true strength of the turbines would be shown when the ship was making maximum speed, and most of the benefits at those speeds didn't relate necessarily to power, but instead reliability and durability. Here is British Admiral Bacon to explain, quote, "No greater single step towards efficiency in war has ever been made than the introduction of the turbine. Previous to its adoption, every day steaming at high speed meant several days' overhaul of machinery in harbor. All this was changed as if by magic." End quote. Much of this increase in reliability was down to the differences in how the 2 types of engines worked, and particularly around how much vibration was caused when running the engines at their maximum output. Now, oftentimes, engines were not run at their maximum output for a lot of exercises during peacetime, but it was recognized that during war, there would be many, many more opportunities for ships to want to run their engines at the very high end of their output for a lengthy period of time. Even though Fisher wanted a speedy ship, and one with big guns, he also wanted one that was well protected, and for this purpose the Dreadnought would have 5,000 tons of armor plating, which was 800 tons more than the previous class of British battleship, the Lord Nelson class. Even with all of these improvements over the previous ship, Fisher also wanted something that did not greatly increase either the size or the cost of construction. This resulted in the Dreadnought being only 85 feet longer and 2 feet wider, and about 1,400 tons heavier than the Lord Nelson's. It would also cost only an additional £181,000, with a total cost of £1.7 million. The cost of the ship was important to Fisher. He was still trying to keep the overall naval budget under control, and he also knew that the ship would be controversial, and so he wanted to prevent critics from using cost as a possible angle to prevent the ship from being accepted by Parliament. The keel of the Dreadnought would be laid down on October 2, 1905, and in early February 1906, it was complete. Due to the revolutionary nature of the Dreadnought, Fisher wanted to pause all British battleship design until after it had been built and tested, and this put an absolute priority on getting the ship to sea as quickly as possible. To accelerate the construction, an emphasis had been put on simplicity from a design perspective, and for construction, all available resources were put into the ship. At the Naval Yard, a total of 3,000 men would work on the ship during the height of its construction, and other ships were either cancelled or delayed to free up workers and material. This included the last two Lord Nelson-class battleships, which were still under construction, but were robbed of their 12-inch guns and mountings. These 8 guns were instead given over to the Dreadnought, specifically because the guns and the mountings were the pieces of the ship that would take the longest to build. All of this construction focus would allow the ship, which in February had officially been given the name Dreadnought, to go to sea on October 1st, 1906, just a year after construction started. In early October, the ship would undergo sea trials, including the first run of 8 hours at full speed on October 8th, and then the first full broadside firing test a few days later. At the time, this moment was a cause of concern, because nobody really knew what firing 8 12-inch guns simultaneously aboard one ship would do. Some thought that it would damage the ship due to the concussion of the blast, but these theories would prove to be incorrect. Although it is interesting, at least to me, that such concerns would actually be a major problem for capital ships in the decades that followed, especially during wartime, when they were sort of firing their guns at angles that maybe were unexpected or unplanned for. But in the Dreadnought's firing tests, everything worked just fine. Then on December 11th, 1906, the Dreadnought was accepted into the Royal Navy, and a new age of naval warfare had started.
Things change, but Deer Park Natural Spring Water is a constant you can count on, bringing you the essence of home for 150 years and counting. Sourced from carefully selected springs, Deer Park Natural Spring Water has naturally occurring electrolytes for a crisp, refreshing taste. Find Deer Park Natural Spring Water at your favorite local retailer today. After 150 years, there's only one thing left to say. Deer Park, that's still good water.
Along with the Dreadnought, the Committee on Designs would also create the detailed plans for a class of new ships, which is what Fisher believed would be the future of naval combat. The name of this class of ship would fluctuate, but would eventually be the battlecruiser. Although the first round of designs that we discussed earlier would actually make a more traditional armored cruiser, there would be another round shortly thereafter. In From the Dreadnought to Scapa Flow, the Royal Navy in the Fisher era, 1904 to 1919, Arthur Martyr would describe the design principles of the battlecruiser like this. The reason for the battlecruiser was threefold: to have armored ships to act as super scouting cruisers, ships fast and powerful enough to push home a reconnaissance in the face of an enemy's big armored cruisers. They needed to be fast enough to hunt down and destroy the fastest armed merchant raiders, especially the 23-knot German transatlantic liners, which were known to be carrying guns for commerce destruction in war. And number 3, to act as a fast wing reinforcing the van or rear of a battle fleet in a general action. End quote. The ships, as designed by the committee, would seek to accomplish this goal with a displacement of 17,000 tons, roughly 1,000 tons less than the Dreadnought, but a speed of 25 knots. Much like the Dreadnought, these ships would only be focused on the biggest of guns with 8 12-inch guns mounted on them. One big difference is that these ships would be equipped with 16 4-inch guns that were designed to deal with smaller ships, in particular enemy destroyers. In essence, the theory was not greatly different from the armored cruisers that they would replace. They were faster, less heavily armed, and had greater endurance than the battleships of the main fleet. However, the one big difference is that they would have the exact same guns as the larger ships, but with far less armor. This setup was absolutely fine if they were going to be used for their original purpose, which was commerce raiding, commerce protection, and scouting. The problem with this design, which would only come into play later, was that because they mounted the same guns as the larger ships, the temptation to include them in a line of dreadnoughts and to use them in a similar way in a fleet action would prove to be completely irresistible. And when used in that way, not as scouts by the vanguard of a battle fleet, but instead as part of the battle line to engage other battlecruisers and other battleships, their weaknesses in terms of armor would be really easily exposed. But even this battlecruiser idea that Fisher saw as part of the future was not the future that he wanted, or what he believed would be the actual final design. This was instead something that he called the fusion design, and that was a ship that would combine the arms and armament of a battleship with the speed of the battle cruiser. For this design, he put together a second committee on designs to discuss this, and what he wanted was for them to design a ship that had the armor and guns of the Dreadnought combined with the speed of the first class of battle cruisers, the Invincible class. So he wanted basically a battleship that was a lot faster. For the committee that was created by Fisher, this was kind of taking things a step too far because they believed that such a ship, even if it were possible, would be so expensive that it would drastically reduce the number of capital ships that could be built. The committee would then argue that this would be counterproductive to British goals of maintaining naval superiority, and it should only really be pursued once they were in a very advantageous position in comparison to other navies around the world. This was because they just didn't think there was the money to get to the numerical superiority that the British thought they needed while building these very expensive sort of fusion design ships. This rejection of the fusion design would maintain the division between battleships and battle cruisers, with battleships having more armor and more guns, and the battle cruisers having less armor and more speed. This difference would briefly evaporate in the construction of the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships in the years before the First World War. They were perhaps the best example of the type of fusion design that Fisher was pursuing almost a decade earlier. They were able to kind of match the protection of a battleship with the speed of the battlecruisers, even being placed among the battlecruisers during the war. The second committee on designs, though, was not wrong, because the Queen Elizabeth class would be much more expensive than other ships that had come before. And also, they were introduced kind of at a point where the British had clearly sort of asserted their superiority over the Germans in their ability to build ships in the years that preceded the introduction of the Queen Elizabeth design. So the British were building these ships, they were planning to build even better ships or bigger ships or more powerful ships. But the creation of the Dreadnought did not occur in a vacuum, and rumors of the plans for the ships would begin to make their way back to Berlin specifically in early 1905. At the beginning, the exact details were hazy, but the one feature of the ships that the Germans would know about pretty much right from the beginning was the presence of a large number of 12-inch guns, and that the ship would be somewhere around 18,000 tons displacement. This presented a whole host of problems to Tirpitz. The first problem was such a large change in power for British ships was not accounted for in German naval building plans. There had been some budget increases built in and some allowances made for ships becoming more expensive, but nothing like what would be required to meet the challenge of the Dreadnought. Up until this point, German battleships had been arguably inferior to the British ships that they were being built against due to their guns and armor. With the Dreadnought representing a huge jump in capabilities, the planned German ships would be in an even worse position. There were also some intractable logistical problems that the Germans would have to overcome if they wanted to keep building larger ships. German dockyards could not build ships as large as the Dreadnought, a problem that could only be resolved with large capital investments. Another very expensive problem was the Kiel Canal. The canal was the one that joined the Baltic and North Seas together and was a critical piece of German strategic mobility because it allowed the German Navy to kind of move back and forth between the two seas. Widening the canal was possible, but it would be very expensive, and Tirpitz was concerned that the cost involved with both of these large infrastructure projects would be used by critics of the Navy to kind of derail his plans. These plans were, as they were in 1905, was to introduce a novelle to the naval law to add in the construction of a few cruisers, which would be used for overseas duty. No more dreadnoughts, just some cruisers. This plan was even announced in February of 1905 by Tirpitz and the German Budget Commission. It would later be withdrawn because Tirpitz and Capelle decided that the plans for 1906 would have to be changed to introduce a new and larger novelle which would function as the official political reaction to the dreadnought. The new plans would force German designers to look into battleships that were roughly equivalent to the dreadnought, and they would aim for roughly 18,000 tons, somewhere around 22 knots in speed, and an armament focused on only the largest guns available. This would entail a large increase in the cost on a ship-by-ship basis, which would have to be included in future estimates. It is worth noting that the jump from pre-dreadnought to dreadnought was more costly relatively for the Germans, because their pre-dreadnoughts had been made cheaper by reducing capabilities, so the jump was sort of bigger between the two classes of ships on the German side. This is what made them cost so much more for the Germans, when for the British, as just discussed, the dreadnought didn't actually cost that much more than the ships that came before. Even though the Germans chose to mostly just try and match what the British were doing, such a plan represented a more conservative approach when compared with what some German leaders were advocating for at this point. Many wanted not just to match the British, but to kind of one-up them. Like the British had one-upped the Germans, and so they wanted to one-up them back. They didn't just want to match what they were doing. Tirpitz was unwilling to make this commitment, still fearful of the possible political consequences. At this stage, Tirpitz was unwilling to give up his naval dreams entirely, but also was balancing that against not wanting to jeopardize them in the Reichstag by kind of pushing too far. One great benefit of the dreadnought that Tirpitz and the German Navy did appreciate to some level is that by introducing such a drastic step in naval construction, the British had given the Germans a gift, an amazing gift. The Royal Navy had held a crushing advantage in pre-dreadnought battleships in 1905, but now that those ships were clearly outclassed, both the British and Germans could start building dreadnoughts. In this new category of ships, the British did not have a crushing advantage. They had an advantage of exactly one ship. Back in London, Fisher was getting some criticism for the dreadnought design and for introducing the dreadnought for similar reasons. On the non-technical side, many of these concerns were around the idea that I just talked about with the Germans, that by creating the dreadnought, Fisher was essentially resetting the board in terms of naval power around the globe. This completely wiped away the Royal Navy's great, completely unassailable lead in pre-dreadnought battleships. There was also those who claimed that by increasing the size, firepower, and sort of expense of each of these ships, he was forcing the Empire to spend more money on the Navy in general. This was, as they would claim, like a self-inflicted wound, because the Empire needed ships all around the globe to protect it, and if each of those ships was more expensive now, then maintaining worldwide security would be drastically more expensive as well. This gave other powers around the world the ability to begin building programs maybe at the same tempo as the British, nullifying any advantage that the Royal Navy had in the years that preceded the introduction of the dreadnought. Fisher would claim that if the British didn't do it, somebody else would, because you can't stop the forward march of progress. While this was probably accurate, at the time there were rumors that several other nations were beginning to consider ships much like the dreadnought. By introducing the new class of ships in 1906, Fisher probably accelerated that process by a little bit. There were also those who criticized the dreadnought on a technical level, disagreeing with specific decisions made during the design and construction of the ship. One area of complaint was around the armor provided for the ship. When compared with the Lord Nelson's, the dreadnought did have more armor, but it was clear from the design that it could have carried more, but it had to be kept at a certain level due to Fisher's preference for speed. Many believed that it was more important for a battleship to be well armored than to be speedy, which would prove to be absolutely not the case during the First World War. Another area of criticism was the complete lack of any secondary armament on the ship. One of the criticisms that the ship would come under, around only having larger guns, is that there were a group of people, a group of naval designers and naval theorists, who believed that smaller guns were better because they were more accurate at longer ranges, at least theoretically, and an important part of the guns was simply to keep hitting the enemy. Even if each hit did less damage, if you could hit them with more, because you could fire faster because smaller guns were able to fire faster, then that was more advantageous, especially when it came to keeping contact with the enemy and keeping them vulnerable to further engagement due to destruction of unarmored areas of the ship, specifically their superstructure. To combat this criticism, the Admiralty would give information on a private basis to several sort of public critics about tests it had done in 1905. These were firing tests done at a range of about 6,000 yards, which was considered to be about normal in terms of engagement ranges at the time. Over a span of 10 minutes, 2 guns of each caliber, 6, 9.2, and 12, were fired at the targets as quickly as possible. During this time, the 12-inch guns hit the target with 5 times more shell weight compared to the 6-inch guns, and 3 times more than the 9.2-inch guns. The 12-inch guns also hit with a higher percentage of their shots, even though they fired less total shells in general. This did help quiet the critics because it basically disproved all of their arguments. But really, this disagreement would become a non-issue as the engagement ranges at sea grew in the years before the First World War. Eventually, they would reach a point where only the largest guns had the range to compete at sort of the expected engagement ranges. There were others who believed that smaller guns were essential, not to engage other capital ships, but to combat smaller ships like torpedo boats and destroyers. Smaller guns with their faster firing rates made it easier to hit these smaller ships, and the power of the larger guns were not really required. In the years after the launching of the Dreadnought, this would prove to be a very valid criticism that would actually change the design of future Dreadnoughts. The original Dreadnought only had large guns, but then in future generations there would be 4-inch guns or 6-inch guns sort of brought back onto the ships specifically to sort of protect them from destroyers or small cruisers. One of Fisher's most outspoken critics during his time at the Admiralty would be Admiral Lord Charles Beresford. Beresford was a well-liked admiral, both in the Navy and in the country, and during his time in the Navy and in command, Beresford was really good at some parts of being a captain and then an admiral. He had really good relations with the men, he was known for his seamanship skills, but was not known as a great strategic or tactical mind. When Fisher took over at the Admiralty, Beresford was the most senior admiral and would have taken command of the fleet in wartime. In 1906, he was disappointed when Fisher, who reached the typical retirement age of admirals, made it clear that he had no intention of stepping down. This frustrated Beresford, who was more than likely next in line to be the first Sea Lord. This would just be the most recent item that Beresford disagreed with Fisher on, though, because over the previous years, as Fisher introduced his reforms, Beresford disagreed with most of them. He would initially speak out against Fisher's scrapping policies and his emphasis on economic considerations, and then against the Dreadnought. The Navy would enter 1908 as a fractured service, with both Fisher and Beresford having their own followers among the Navy's leadership. This antagonism bled out into the British press, and a heated battle for public opinion would rage. All of these problems would come to a head during the summer of 1909 when an event named the Naval Scare of 1909 would occur. This scare would be caused by the greatly increased German building tempo, a tempo that Beresford did not believe Fisher was doing enough to match. Again, the disagreements would come out in the press, and eventually Beresford would retire almost in protest. All of these arguments caused support for Fisher to wane, with many calling for a new leader that would unite instead of divide the Navy. Fisher's actions were only one of the reasons for all of this heated disagreement. The other was the German building programs that would escalate after 1906. These would cause the real naval arms race to begin, upping the pressure on both sides, and on Fisher and on Tirpitz, and it would start with the 1906 Novelle, which will be the topic for our next episode.